Hello, everyone, and welcome to our presentation for Interface 2021 in Omaha on the role of identity in Zero Trust security. We're excited to be here with you and encourage you to ask questions during or after the presentation at our booth or any other time. Before we get started, we want to offer just a quick disclaimer that there are some other very important aspects of Zero Trust security that we won't be talking about today, like intrusion detection and response, network and endpoint protection, and data security, to name a few. These are definitely critical aspects of Zero Trust security programs too, and we're not trying to ignore or minimize them, but rather focus on the increasingly important role that identity technologies and practices have in a successful Zero Trust strategy. That said, let's introduce ourselves quick. My name is Ryan Babbitt. I'm a Director of Research and Technology with Xeris in our identity and access management space. I've been with our company 10 years and worked on implementations ranging from multi-factor authentication and fraud detection to identity governance, as well as privileged access management.
And my name is David Klein. I'm the VP of Governance Services for Xeris. I've been with the company for the last 11 years, and the last 8 of which have been focused exclusively on governance implementations.
So if you're not familiar with Xeris, we are a fairly small Midwest services provider headquartered in West Des Moines, Iowa. We have several practice areas of expertise in addition to identity and access management, as you see on the left here. We do have various technical partnerships that align with these practice areas, but our view is really that our people are our best product. We pride ourselves in the expertise of our employees. As you see, we have plenty of certifications and all types of experience in a variety of industries, ranging from small businesses to Fortune 500 companies. When we strive to be strategic partners for our clients, providing optimal solutions to enable long-term success. Okay, so why is identity so important to Zero Trust? Well, the cloud brings increased exposure to corporate resources, whether that be data stores, APIs, applications, or infrastructure, as pretty much anybody with an internet connection can access those resources from anywhere, anytime. The provisioning and administration of those resources often gets divided across multiple teams, even distributed across multiple cloud providers and isolated in different SaaS applications. Any misconfiguration or mismanagement of access and permissions can have a detrimental effect, as compromised cloud resources can be used to get to on-premises resources and vice versa, exposing the entire enterprise to malicious actors. And this is what makes the proper management and governance of identity and access over both on-premises and cloud footprints critical. Understanding what users have, what access to your resources, and knowing what they are doing with them is essential to closing those security gaps and properly protecting all of those sensitive resources wherever they're hosted. The best way to do this is to ensure that only the correct people are accessing those services and applications with the correct level of access, all the while minimizing the impact of potential compromise by limiting effective permission and watching account activity for signs of compromise. This is really what puts identity at the heart of security and at the heart of Zero Trust. And it's what we want to explore today, providing some insights and best practice recommendations from our experiences. So just in case you are not familiar with Zero Trust, there are generally 3 principles that get discussed in one form or another. First, it's pretty well known that most attacks involve weak, stolen, or compromised passwords. And even though strengthening password management is very important for improving overall security, passwords by themselves ultimately shouldn't be trusted, because no matter how strong they are, they can still be compromised in a variety of ways. Never trust always verify means that we need additional assurance or some additional piece of information besides the password to establish the claimed identity of a user. This typically takes the form of multi-factor authentication and should be enforced for every user and every transaction to the degree possible. We also need to minimize privilege for both human identities as well as digital and machine identities, both in terms of coarse-grained access related to accounts and their entitlements, and in terms of the fine-grained permissions associated with those entitlements, like read permission to a sensitive file or write permission to a database table. This will both reduce the attack surface available to malicious actors and will limit their ability to move laterally between accounts and machines. Lastly, Monitor continuously has taken the perspective that compromise or breach is pretty much unavoidable, if not already underway. So it's best just to assume that it's there and constantly look for any indicators of malicious activity or risky behavior. The goal is to be as proactive as possible when detecting attacks so they can be contained and remediated early. Here's a quick introduction reference to the identity tools that are most helpful in realizing zero trust security, namely access management, identity governance, privileged access management, and data access governance, and some of their key capabilities and features here. For the sake of time, we have to assume some familiarity with these tools, but please feel free to take a screenshot or reach out to us afterwards or during the presentation if you have any questions about specifics here. Now, let's see how these tools help to realize those zero trust principles, and here's some recommendations for putting them into practice. Never trust, always verify. Again, it bears repeating that password security is always going to be very important, so best practices should still be followed, like maintaining strong password policies to ensure passwords are sufficiently complex and changed with reasonable frequency. Single sign-on and password synchronization are used to reduce the number of passwords that need to be remembered by users, while still ensuring that those strong passwords are used both for network and local authentication, and eliminating shared credentials as much as possible, or at least vaulting them for additional traceability and security, and rotating them after their use. However, we still don't want to trust passwords by themselves, so implementing MFA is a must to achieve verification of the user. You should do this across all channels of user engagement, not just web, but also your mobile and call center channels too, so there's additional assurance that users are who they claim to be, no matter which way they're interacting with you. You should move away from challenge questions as they're not a true second factor. Since passwords are already something that a user knows, you should really combine them with something that a user has, like an authenticator app, or something that a user is, like biometric, Touch ID, or Face ID. Also, it's best to use those more modern factors like authenticator apps, biometrics, or even FIDO-compliant hardware tokens, because they provide a stronger level of assurance, as opposed to more legacy factors like one-time passcode sent over email or SMS. But that may not always be realistic depending on your users and their technical affinity. So if you do need to use those legacy factors, incorporate identity proofing or risk intelligence services to make sure that they can be trusted and that they truly belong to the user and don't have any other risk factors that should prevent their use, like being reported as fraud or for fraud, or as being lost or stolen, for example. When implementing MFA, it's also important to keep usability in mind so that you don't introduce too much friction to the user experience. Single sign-on not only eliminates the fatigue of repeatedly entering credentials, but also provides a handy means to provide step-up authentication or re-authentication for prompting users for additional factors when required. Federated single sign-on via SAML or OIDC We'll also let business partner applications, cloud applications, and mobile applications participate in these same authentication policies. And that leads to a good question. How often should you do MFA? There's really no silver bullet, as it depends on your risk tolerance, the level of enforceability, and other mitigating controls you have in place, like the degree of monitoring and least privilege you've implemented. But generally, we recommend MFA in the following scenarios. When users cross an important system boundary for the first time, like logging into a new machine or network, especially if privileged resources are involved. When navigating to an application with a higher need for security, say because it contains PII or is otherwise regulated. Whenever performing a sensitive business transaction liable to fraud, like withdrawing money, or when performing administrative activities that could affect critical resources. Another important point to mention here is that PAM tools can be used to extend and enforce MFA for when users check out privileged credentials or start privileged sessions, or even elevate those local privileges within a session and requiring MFA for those. This way, the identity of the administrator can be verified for the activities performed before and during those privileged sessions. Lastly, if you're able to, and your access management system supports it, incorporate risk signals from threat intelligence and user behavior analytics to require MFA if anything about the user, device, location, or session seems too risky or somehow anomalous from past behavior. In this way, you can continually evaluate the risk level for each interaction across your different channels of user engagement and adapt the level of verification needed based on that risk and based on the resource being accessed. This will really progress you towards that goal of verifying every user and every transaction. And just real quick, I do want to touch on digital and machine identities too, like process and service accounts. We'd like strong authentication for them too, but it's not likely they'll be able to support MFA. So making sure the passwords are extra strong and also rotated regularly is very important here. You could also use client certificate-based authentication as a type of second factor, or even in place of passwords if need be. Also, you should protect APIs by OAuth and OIDC protocols to make sure that calling client applications are appropriately authenticated and authorized to invoke them. If personal resources are being processed, you also have the ability to authenticate and authorize the application user too, which means that MFA policies will be applied in those contexts as well. Finally, just a few miscellaneous pieces of parting advice. Take the time to understand what data and resources are accessible from the applications or systems your users are authenticating to, so you can set verification policies accordingly while also not burdening them with too much MFA. Try to phase out those existing legacy factors if possible, but if you can't, at least make modern ones available and start the education and transition and training process. If you can break your user base into smaller segments and release new factors to them incrementally, that'll be helpful. And lastly, encourage backup MFA channels in case that primary ones become lost, stolen, or otherwise unavailable due to risk. So here are the tables showing the different aspects of verification supported by different identity tools, most of which I touched upon. I think the only things I didn't really mention were how you can check for the safety of passwords during password recovery and reset by using services like haveibeenpwned.com to make sure that those new passwords haven't been exposed in a previous breach, as well as the possibility of background processes in various tools to perform identity proofing and risk intelligence checks in the event that users don't interact with your system very much. You can do those offline. Otherwise, as you can see, credential security remains a big component of a lot of these tools, and access management and privileged access management are really the primary enforcers for MFA.
So the next principle that I'd like to talk about is minimizing privilege. Minimizing privilege really amounts to minimizing risk. Fewer privileges means that it's less likely that accidental or malicious data loss will occur, and lateral movement is much more difficult. Also, some regulations will require least privilege to be implemented for access to certain kinds of data like PII. Some general guidelines that we have here are eliminating stale or unused access. So you can use data access governance to help identify access that's been unused for a significant period of time, or you may be able to leverage your access management system's logging as well. Next, plan on reducing standing access as much as possible. What you're focusing on is trying to answer the question, do users have more than they need to do their job? And this is a pretty common problem. Often in organizations, a new hire's access is set up as a copy of another user. Well, if that existing person had been with the company for 10 years and had taken access from multiple different jobs or different departments along with them, now you're granting all of that to your new user. So you definitely want to review your access and avoid that kind of problem. Next is the goal of just-in-time privileged access. The goal here is that elevated rights are only acquired when they're needed. So this is another common scenario that's implemented in a PAM solution. Keep in mind that PAM shouldn't just be thought of as credential vaulting or session checkout. Those are a little bit legacy use cases, if you will. But really, PAM should be a way to control when elevated rights are actually necessary. And then a complementary concept is zero standing privilege. If that privilege isn't being used currently, remove it from the user. Another more lofty goal is ephemeral access for elevated rights accounts. In this scenario, the account doesn't even exist until it's needed to perform a particular task. This is really beneficial where you want to completely remove any kind of standing privileges. You want to minimize your attack surface entirely. The best way to do that is to have no account at all. Getting there's process, and it may not always be applicable or possible for every use case. So again, all of these are supporting that goal of reducing your attack surface and protecting you both from external bad actors and from internal risk, whether that risk is intentional or not. So a user can't accidentally put a list of social security numbers on an unsecured S3 bucket if they don't have access to read those SSNs in the first place. So next, we'll talk a little bit about two high-level general categories of privilege. One is long-standing privilege, which is your normal day-to-day usage, and then privileged access, which tends to be more infrequent or could also use some dedicated accounts like service accounts. So here's an overall process to getting your long-standing access under control. First of all, remember that perfect is the enemy of good. It's better to start with something and make some gradual improvements rather than avoiding taking control of access in your organization because it's just too daunting. Then later, you'll wish that you had taken better control after you've been breached. So one of the first steps is identifying your user groups. So some examples are customers, employees, and third parties, and you can certainly break them down into more detailed areas to align with the business activities for each. And as that would imply, this requires quite a bit of business expertise. So in this scenario, expect to work quite a bit with your business teams. And then work to map those kind of activities to what access is actually required to perform them. So this is a good collaboration between IT and the business to answer that question. So a few of the things that you're looking for include, what does that access provide to systems? And then is that access or data risky or sensitive? And the access that applies to a user may not be clear all the time. One example is the case of nested groups. Or you may also have granted access to that resource directly to a user and not through a group at all. So you can use data access governance to understand the effective privileges. One of your next tasks can be creating a good metadata catalog of the access that business users will understand in their terms. That metadata can be stored in your identity governance solution, and that will help with future access requests, approvals, and certifications. It will give your business users more clarity in what that access actually allows a person to do and the risk of that access. Next, you really need to focus on addressing current user access. This is a cleanup process. So it can be a very large undertaking, and you may want to prioritize which systems that you're going to address, focusing on core systems like directories first, maybe financial systems or otherwise regulated systems. Next, use certifications in your governance tool to validate that that access is necessary. And use that with a closed loop remediation process to remove that unused or stale access or access that just doesn't apply anymore. And you can also use your identity governance tool to automate lifecycle management and provisioning processes for more consistency with onboarding and offboarding processes, as well as making sure users all have the same kind of access if they're in similar user groups. And finally, as I mentioned before, use data access governance to unravel those nested entitlements and determine what the effective permissions are. And you can potentially use this info to restructure those entitlements. Another significant thing that you can do is implement an RBAC solution. So as I mentioned first, you definitely want to clean up those that existing access first so that you can build cleaner roles. You can do this, again, after those access certifications are complete, so that's a very good first step. An RBAC solution will help consistency and eliminate outliers. So again, for similar user groups, you want to have consistent access to systems, and outliers tend to be more risky. So you want to identify and eliminate those. And like everything else, because this is a big process, you want to approach it in baby steps. Start with your obvious roles first, the kinds of things that you intuitively know that many people get in your organization today. And then gradually grow to adding more roles or refining existing roles, especially as new systems are added. And if you can, leverage AI technologies to determine what those roles should be, what their contents should be, and how those roles should evolve over time. Roles are not static anymore. They shouldn't be viewed that way. They can and should evolve with your organization. You won't have your call center doing the same activities this year as you did 5 years ago or 5 years in the future. And finally, implement temporal grants for short-term access. If someone from your accounts payable department is on leave and you need to grant that functionality to another person, don't just grant it to them indefinitely, give it to them with a specific end date. Finally, after you've done this cleanup, focus on implementing recurring and event-driven access reviews. These can be annual reviews or quarterly reviews for more risky access, which of course, as you're adding more, means this can lead to certification fatigue for your reviewers. So help them understand why it's important and provide tools like AI to shoulder more of the burden so they can focus on the most risky or most important items to review. The event-driven review should occur for events such as changing departments or job titles, where you would naturally expect that some kind of access change should occur. Now, the second category that we wanted to talk about is managing privileged access. So as Ryan mentioned earlier, you really want to eliminate shared accounts as much as possible, and then vault and rotate credentials with your PAN tool for any standing privileged accounts. Finally, you want to review those standing accounts to determine if standing access is actually necessary or if it can be removed and created on the fly when needed. If it can, then you want to convert to that zero standing privilege model using your PAM implementation. You can also integrate PAM with access management to implement MFA for getting access to your privilege sessions. So again, as Ryan mentioned, you don't want to forget about your digital identities. You have service accounts and other kinds of accounts in your organization that are just as important to conduct access reviews and credential vaulting with them. So there may be some protections like MFA that aren't practical for these kind of accounts. And in that case, use certificates or other kinds of authentication to grant access. Our overall advice is really, again, just start small, focus on the users or systems and resources with the highest risk, and then perform cleanup steps before you implement an RBAC solution or make any other sweeping changes to access. You really want to start with the cleanest model possible. And then finally, manage and model that access according to the business tasks. So you'll be using RBAC requests and approvals and just-in-time access for privileged access, and you'll implement ongoing access reviews to keep that access minimized. Here you can see how the various tools support these user principles. And to be clear, you don't need each tool to be implemented before you get started, but each can work independently if you only have one or two, or they can work together to enhance your zero trust posture. As you can see here, identity governance is your most useful tool in getting control of standing access. PAM will be the most helpful in controlling privileged access, and both are enhanced by DAG in order to discover what access is currently being utilized, how it may be masked by nesting privileges, and in some cases, when it may be granted directly to a user as opposed to through roles and groups. And as mentioned before, it can provide more of that metadata about your privileged accounts and your risky entitlements into your governance solution. So again, enhancing and getting better value from the tools really happens when you integrate them. So a couple examples of that are that sensitive data access that was identified by DAG. Use that in your identity governance tool lifecycle management processes, RBAC implementation, informing your users during approval process and during certifications. Another example is using or identifying privileged access that's used during PAM activities to your governance tool, so that that access or those entitlements are not granted to your standard everyday primary accounts on a regular basis. Really focus on reserving those privileged entitlements for your privileged accounts.
Okay, and that brings us back to monitor continuously. Now, talking about security monitoring can be a bit of a challenge because different companies can have vastly different abilities here. Some companies have well-established log analytics tool chains, full-blown SIEM implementations, and automated remediation. And some just have source logs themselves or are just getting started on this journey. So keeping this in mind, I'll try to make a few points to help out both levels of maturity. First, I'll point out some key monitoring, reporting, and investigation capabilities that are natively supported by identity tools. And then I'll talk about a way to integrate identity a little bit deeper into your security monitoring practice. Okay, first for native monitoring, we already talked about access management in the context of verification in MFA, but I do also want to note that these tools help provide centralized logging for authentication events. Reports over attempts and failures for different users, devices, and locations helps to identify risky trends or risky entities that may need to be watched more closely, or maybe even integrated into that risk-based approach of adapting to that risk and requiring additional factors that we talked about before. They'll likely have, these tools also have threat detection capabilities to help discover both brute force attacks like credential stuffing and password spraying, and behavioral analytics capabilities to spot more direct attacks that might arise due to abnormalities or differences from a user's behavior now versus in the past. For data access governance, the activity monitoring capabilities to highlight are that they often consolidate source logs from a variety of on-premises and cloud data stores. And they're really good at extracting the important details of who, what, where, and when out of those source logs to provide a simplified audit trail to make understanding data access activity and system changes much easier. This can really help monitoring across that data footprint, whether unstructured or structured data. Their reporting and investigation capabilities can be used to see trends, potential threats, and anomalies related to data access, like users that have the most access to sensitive data, surges of sensitive data reads, or maybe something like mass deletion of sensitive data too, or possibly even the presence of files with known ransomware extensions, for example. PAM tools provide activity monitoring and threat detection for privileged sessions and the activities that occur in them. Session monitoring can range from simple video recordings of remote desktop and SSH sessions to searchable logs of screen events and command line text. If a PAM tool involves an agent on an endpoint device, it can also provide a list of the system resources accessed during a session, or even the list of allowed and blocked files and applications on that endpoint based off of the PAM policies. Like DAG, or like Data Access Governance, these tools can also be helpful for centralizing and simplifying logs from different types of systems to create more organized view of privileged activities across different pieces of your infrastructure and applications. The threat detection and analytics features are more geared towards credential theft and malware detection, as well as finding incidences of local privilege escalation and lateral movement, and are really beneficial for investigating insider threats. So these native monitoring capabilities can be used independently and in their own right or side by side for greater value. But these tools will also support SIEM integrations to allow for them to be brought into a more comprehensive or more secure security analytics solution if desired. And that's what I will be talking to next. If you're interested in a deeper integration of identity into your security monitoring practices, here's a pattern or a framework to follow and some things to keep in mind. So the first point is that you'll need to have well-defined identity processes and a detailed understanding of how those processes are implemented across your identity tool suite. I'm thinking in particular here of things like password management operations, access provisioning, and permissions changes. This understanding is going to need to be detailed enough to know for any given identity operation who or what initiated or triggered the operation, the governance controls accompanying or authorizing the operation, which would be something like an access request approval, certification decision, or access being provisioned or removed based off of a change in roles, as well as the set of resulting changes that will be made in target applications and systems, and the mechanisms by which those changes will be fulfilled, whether manually by an administrator or automatically via an identity server. So here's an example of what I mean. Let's consider a Windows administrator who wants to start a privileged session. He requests a privileged session from a PAM system. That's the initiation and trigger. The PAM tool requires an approval for this session, which is granted by a PAM administrator. That's the governance control. And in this situation, let's say the account already exists, but there's no privilege associated with it, and it's been disabled because just-in-time provisioning is being used. So the PAM server rotates the password of the account, re-enables it, and adds the admin to the local administrators group. And finally, brokers a remote desktop connection to the server using that new password. So those are all the effects of the operation here: changing the password, updating the status, provisioning the new group, and making that connection. The fulfillment in this case is automated and is done by the PAM system as opposed to being done manually by an administrator. And you can think of, that's just an example, you can think of other identity operations too, like those made by help desk administrators, those that are driven from HR-based provisioning for access via role-based access control policies, and others in a similar way. So the next step, after making sure that you understand those identity operations and how they play out in your infrastructure and systems, is to ingest those identities in source logs. So the PAM server logs and the Windows server logs in our example, so that they can be compared with each other. So ideally, when a change event occurs in a source log, like a credential reset, an account update, right, an authentication, there's going to be a corresponding identity operation that's responsible for initiating or authorizing that event. If there isn't one, if there is no corresponding identity operation, it's entirely possible that that event represents an attempt by a rogue administrator to bypass identity controls, or is maybe the action of a compromised account that isn't aware of them. So, of course, that may not always be the case. It could be a false positive caused by some valid business process, but it should be investigated nonetheless if there is such a discrepancy. Identity processes, if need be, can be refined or re-implemented to better support that business process, or maybe the business process itself can be changed for better involvement and integration with identity controls. One quick suggestion here is that if an action does need to be taken directly in an application or system, we highly recommend using a PAM tool to manage that interaction, whether it's running, going to a desktop remotely, or remote hosting a remote application, or some other low-level privileged operation. Of course, the session recording is optional. So in case you're thinking that, Ryan, that really seems like there's going to be a large number of these types of events and alerts that will be occurring outside of identity processes. Well, we can use identity tools to also help create risk functions to help us understand and prioritize those events. So the idea here is that really any fine-grained permission that provides access to sensitive data or a privileged system resource should be marked or tagged as risky. Ideally, this would be done in a tool like Data Access Governance or PAM, as they can automatically discover those low-level permissions. And then any entitlements to which those permissions are assigned in source systems and applications can be tagged themselves as risky in either the Identity Governance or PAM tool that manages them. Like David talked about, those access catalogs that are used during requests and reviews. And that information can be further propagated up the access hierarchy to also tag any role that grants that risky entitlement, or any account that already has that risky entitlement assigned to it. So the idea really is that the more risky entitlements and permissions that an account or a role has or a user has, the greater the risk level associated with that account, and the higher the priority that events involving that account should receive. So if risk scores are something that you're interested in, you could also associate numerical values as need be, or even for more comprehensive risk function, integrate signals from those other detection and analytics capabilities that I talked about, from access management, data access governance, and PAM tools, or even some of those other security tools that we mentioned at the beginning. And then, of course, you'd be investigating those incidents, with whatever capabilities, tools, and technologies you have at your disposal. And if you do need to respond to those, if you do decide that they are potentially a malicious event, we've got a couple of ideas of what to do there. Just some couple recommendations first are that you should really send notifications to account owners for key lifecycle events related to passwords, user profile changes, and relevant provisioning events, since it does give those users a chance to report changes they didn't make or request themselves. And similarly, notifications should be sent to source administrators. So when those changes are detected outside of governance processes, so they have an ability to change those behaviors to better align with those processes, or potentially report if that account, if their account has been compromised. Or again, maybe it's the case that it's totally legitimate and you need to update your identity process to reflect that. If you do detect a security incident, it's also something to think about is that identity tools do also provide convenient options for some quick response and remediation. So these range from locking or terminating ongoing sessions, whether it's a web session with access management or a privileged session with privileged access management tools, revoking tokens that are being used by applications that are granted via OAuth or OIDC, which should be done from access management tool, to disabling and locking accounts involved in these incidents, which could be done with identity governance and PAM tools to remove whether it's standing access or ephemeral access, and removing entitlements and fine-grained permissions, which could be done across a selection of these different tools, depending on if they're managed in your governance, identity governance, PAM, or data access governance tooling. So these actions can be taken, manually or as a result of an automated orchestration. And how you do that or when you do that is really up to your comfort level with that. But I just want to point out that those responses and remediations should themselves also be traceable and integrated into this process so that they're, again, one of those official actions and can be traced as such. So just taking a step back a little bit, it probably seems like this type of deep integration between identity and security monitoring could be a significant amount of effort, and that's true. So if you want to take this type of a journey, as we've said with everything else, you should really start small, focus on your most critical systems and applications, like your directories, databases, and key servers, and you can build on top of that from there as you become more comfortable and capable in this area. If you don't have all of the tools that we've been mentioning, you can still try to incorporate, or you still can incorporate these processes and this type of comparing of source logs and identity operations, as long as you understand those business processes and how they get implemented across your tool suites. And you can make them recognizable and traceable in system logs so that you can understand and compare between those events that are happening in your source and what are officially happening as part of those identity tools, whether they're manual processes like starting things off with ticketing systems or otherwise. All right, so here's just a quick reference table for the different monitoring, reporting, and response and orchestration capabilities of the identity tools that we talked about, the different types of logs that they provide, some of the different risk factors that they enable, and different response capabilities. I think the only thing I didn't really mention here is how account ownership and identity status factor into risk equations, but I think David actually alluded to it. For example, if there's some account that according to the identity status of the account owner shouldn't be active, like if the user is on medical leave or maybe has recently been onboarded or changed job functions, and there's access that should be disabled because of that. If you see activity with that access, of course, those types of inconsistencies could be a sign of malicious activity. And finally, we talked about how different tools support those zero trust and zero trust principles. We hope you've noticed some complementarity and symbiotic relationships among these tools, but we thought it would be useful to call out a few key use cases for integrating them, like how integrating access management and privileged access management provides centralized multi-factor authentication and authentication monitoring across applications and infrastructure. Integrating identity governance, privileged access management can provide a comprehensive approach to minimizing access, as well as providing a convenient way to improve the visibility of that privileged access to governance processes like access requests and certifications. Integrating identity governance and data access governance can similarly help to minimize access to sensitive data and improve its visibility too in those same governance processes. And lastly, ephemeral access to sensitive data by integrating identity governance, by integrating PAM and data access governance can help provide ephemeral access to sensitive data, as well as monitoring and recording those data activities for later review. And here's one last cheat sheet with the major capabilities of these tools and how they relate to the 3 zero trust principles of always verify, minimize privilege, and monitor continuously. And with that, we thank you. We hope you enjoyed our presentation, and we encourage you to stop by our booth and chat with us about your zero trust journey, any pain points you might be having with your identity solutions, or ask any questions about the presentation. And we'll also have some additional resources that you can take a look at. And also want to mention that those that stop by will be registered for some free giveaways, including a Bose wireless speaker and a credential and data security assessment. So thank you so much, and have a great rest of your conference.